Okay, let's unpack this. You know, societies don't just stand still. They shift, they evolve, sometimes they erupt in sudden change. Understanding how that happens, the very engine of history is, well, it's fundamental to making sense of the world around us.
It's a constant puzzle, isn't it? I mean, every generation grapples with why things are the way they are, how we got here, and maybe where we might be going. What's driving that movement? Is it ideas, economics, maybe individuals, or is it some force beyond our control?
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're using excerpts from O.P. Galba's An Introduction to Political Theory as our guide. We've really sifted through these pages to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, hopefully giving you a shortcut to being really well informed on the perspectives presented in this text.
Yeah, our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're diving deep into different concepts and major theories about how societies transform, sticking strictly to what's laid out in these GABA excerpts. We'll look at the foundational vocabulary thinkers use. We'll touch on how some classic minds viewed historical transitions. And then we'll really spend some time unpacking two major and quite contrasting theories that frame a lot of contemporary debate. The Marxist view of revolutionary change and the liberal view of, well, incremental change, step by step.
Right. So by the time we wrap up, you should have a solid grasp of these powerful frameworks, understanding the different forces, everything from deep economic structures to conscious human decisions that, according to these specific perspectives, shape the societies we inhabit. It's a fascinating look at the mechanics of history itself.
Let's jump right in then. The source material kicks off with a really core idea, almost a poetic one, actually, about the fundamental nature of society.
Yes, it starts by saying change isn't just, an occasional thing. It's the fundamental law of life. Society itself is under constant transformation. The text even brings in Tennyson to underline this point. Old order changeth, yielding place to new. It's this recognition that stability is fleeting, really, and flux is the norm.
And this constant flux, this unending process of change, it naturally leads social scientists to ask some really big questions. The source highlights a few crucial ones that thinkers have wrestled with for generations.
Okay, what are some of those core questions the text brings up?
Well, things like, does social change follow a predictable, fixed pattern? Or is it essentially random, maybe chaotic? Is the process of change something that just happens to us, beyond human control? Or can we actually actively manipulate it, guide it, maybe even speed it up? And maybe most fundamentally, is history moving towards some kind of predetermined goal or end state? Or is the future radically uncertain, totally open-ended?
Those questions really frame everything that follows, don't they? And the way different thinkers answer them often boils down to how they define certain key concepts related to change. The source lays out several of these fundamental terms. Let's start with revolution.
Revolution, okay. In this context, it's defined as a sudden or very fast change in the social system. And crucially, it's presented as a profound break with the past. It can affect pretty much all aspects of social life at once.
All aspects. Like what?
We're talking about shifts in the structure of power, the economy, people's daily lives, their norms, their fundamental beliefs. The whole fabric of society, really, can be rewoven in a revolutionary moment.
So not just like a policy tweak, but a whole systemic upheaval.
Yeah.
What triggers something like that, such a sudden transformation?
Well, the source notes that the outcomes, or maybe the manifestations of revolution, can include things like mass uprisings, widespread social mobilization, or even sometimes the huge societal impact of a new discovery or invention.
Right.
It does acknowledge that the underlying factors, the conditions that make a revolution possible, the stresses, the contradictions, the grievances, these might build up over a long time, but the actual moment of revolutionary impact, that's abrupt, a rapid release of all that pent-up pressure.
Okay, so the causes might simmer for ages, but the event itself is swift and transformative. Got it. Now, if revolution is sudden, the next concept, evolution, is presented as, well, the complete opposite, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Stark contrast. Evolution is defined as a perceptible change, yes, but one that results from the cumulative effect of lots and lots of short, often totally imperceptible changes happening over a really long time. It's all about a gradual process that transforms older, simpler social forms into new, more complex ones.
And the source explicitly mentions that this model is borrowed from biological sciences, right?
Right.
Using that analogy of how species evolve through tiny genetic shifts over vast stretches of time, it's about slow, incremental accumulation leading to big overall transformation.
Precisely. It's a completely different tempo, a different mechanism compared to revolution. Then the text introduces the concept of development.
Development, okay. This is described as a process that transforms a system or an institution into something stronger, more organized, more efficient, and ultimately more effective.
Yeah, here the focus is all on functionality and improvement in capacity. The explicit goal of development, as defined here anyway, is to create a system that's more satisfying in terms of meeting human wants and aspirations. It's about becoming better at fulfilling its purpose,
Yeah.
improving its performance along certain defined lines, effectiveness, organization.
So development has a clear functional goal.
Okay.
Okay. Then finally, we have progress. This concept introduces a crucial element that the others don't, according to the source.
It does, and this is a really important distinction to grasp. Progress is defined as a process that transforms a system or institution into a new form that is regarded as better and specifically morally superior to the old one. The absolute key here, as the source points out, is that progress involves moral judgment and evaluation.
Right. So you could maybe empirically measure if a society is developed, like, is its economy more efficient? Are its institutions more organized? But to say it has progressed, that requires applying a value judgment. Is it better in a moral sense?
That's exactly it. While evolution or development might be assessed based on observable complexity or efficiency, progress applies a normative criterion. It asks whether the change represents an improvement not just in function or structure, but in terms of human values, human morality. It's a judgment about the worth of the change for humanity.
That distinction is vital for understanding different views on social change, isn't it? Is change just happening? Evolution? Is it aiming for efficiency development? Or is it actually moving towards something morally better? Progress. So, okay, we have sudden revolution, slow evolution, purposeful development, and morally evaluated progress as our basic vocabulary here.
Right. Those are the building blocks, essentially. Now, having defined these concepts, or at least similar ideas, how have major thinkers historically looked at the grand sweep of history and described the transitions from one type of society to another?
The source gives us a look at several classic figures who tried to characterize these big historical shifts. Let's start with Auguste Comte.
Comte, yeah. One of the founders of sociology. He viewed societal transformation as being driven primarily by the advancement of science and thought. He postulated this fundamental shift from what he called military society to industrial society.
And what were the defining features of those two types for Comte, according to the text?
Well, in his view, military society was characterized by the regimentation of thought and action, a pretty rigid hierarchical system where thinking was constrained. The move to industrial society, which he saw as enabled by scientific progress, was what opened the door to freedom of thought. So for Comte, it was a shift fundamentally tied to intellectual and scientific liberation.
Interesting. And then Herbert Spencer, another really influential thinker, he also used that military society to industrial society transition, but with slightly different characteristics, as the source points out.
Yes, that's right. Spencer saw military society as characterized by integration. Individuals were tightly bound to the prevailing social arrangements with pretty limited personal autonomy. Industrial society, for Spencer, was marked by differentiation. People became freer to specialize in different roles and, crucially, to enter into voluntary relationships.
Voluntary relationships. And the source notes that this idea connects directly to Henry Sumner Maine's work, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, very closely. Maine, who was a legal historian, famously argued that all progressive societies, and notice he explicitly uses the term progressive here, implying that normative judgment we talked about moved from a state of status to a state of contract.
How does he define those? Status and contract.
Status is basically describes a situation where an individual's position, their rights, their obligations are pretty much fixed by birth or tradition within the existing social setup. You're born a serf or a noble or a woman in a certain family, and that largely dictates your life. Contract, on the other hand, signifies the individual's freedom to define their own relationships, obligations, and position through their own free will, via agreement or contract.
So Spencer's move from integrated bound to differentiated voluntary relationships lines up really closely with Maine's shift from fixed status to chosen contract. Both seem to highlight increasing individual freedom and autonomy as a key feature of societal transition.
Absolutely. It's a very similar observation, just framed a bit differently. Then we have Ferdinand Tönnies, the German sociologist, who gave us his famous theory of transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft.
Which translates roughly to community and association, right?
Exactly. Gemeinschaft, or community, is based on what Tönnies called natural will. It's characterized by a high degree of cultural homogeneity, shared values, and relationships that are deeply personal and enduring, often lifelong, based on things like kinship or neighborhood.
Like a traditional village or a really close-knit family structure.
Precisely that kind of thing. Gesellschaft, or association, is based on rational will. It's marked by cultural heterogeneity, much greater anonymity, and relationships that are more impersonal, calculative, and contractual, entered into for specific purposes or mutual gain. Think of the dynamics you find in a large city or a modern marketplace.
And the source points out a significant observation Tunney's made about this shift. It wasn't all positive in his view.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't necessarily presenting this as pure, unadulterated progress. Tönnies observed that the loss of the sense of community that came with the rise of Gesellschaft, the breakdown of those traditional, enduring structures, was actually responsible for many of the social problems he saw emerging in modern industrial society. So there's a sense of something valuable being lost in that transition.
That adds a layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, Emil Durkheim also contrasted different types of societies based on how individuals relate to each other.
Durkheim used the concept of solidarity. Less advanced societies, he argued, are characterized by mechanical solidarity. This is based on resemblance. Individuals are largely similar to each other. They perform similar tasks, share common experiences and beliefs very strongly. They're unified because they are basically alike.
Like a collection of identical parts held together.
Kind of, yeah. Modern advanced societies, however, are characterized by organic solidarity. This is based on complementarities between individuals. Because of the increasing division of labor, people specialize in different roles and tasks. Society functions as a complex whole because these specialized parts are interdependent. They rely on each other, much like the different organs in a living body rely on each other.
Ah, okay. So a society unified by its differences and interdependencies rather than its similarities. Interesting. And finally, the source mentions Max Weber's distinction based on authority.
Weber looked at the legitimate basis of rule, what makes people obey. Traditional society, he explained, is organized around traditional authority. This type of authority gets its legitimacy from long-established customs, traditions, and historical precedent. Power is often inherited or based on ancient ways of doing things like rule by a king or a tribal elder because it has always been done this way.
In modern society, how does that contrast?
Modern society, for Weber, is increasingly dominated by legal rational authority. Here, legitimacy doesn't come from custom or lineage, but from rationally established rules and laws. Authority is vested in offices and positions within a system, and individuals exercise power based on their role within that rational legal framework. Think of bureaucratic authority, or the authority of elected officials operating under a constitution.
Fascinating. So across these different thinkers, Comte, Spencer, Maine, Tönnies, Durkheim, Weber, we see these recurring themes describing historical movement, from constraint to freedom of thought, from integration or status to differentiation or contract, from community to association, from mechanical to organic solidarity, from traditional to legal rational authority.
Yeah, they use different lenses, different terminology, but they often seem to point towards a general trajectory. A move away from more rigid, custom-bound, homogeneous, and integrated social forms towards societies that are more differentiated, individualistic, heterogeneous, and rationally organized.
These historical perspectives give us some really useful context for understanding the core concepts of change. But now, the source shifts focus to two particularly important and contrasting theoretical frameworks that still shape debates about social change today.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting, as you said earlier, because these next two theories offer fundamentally different visions of how significant change actually happens and what really drives it. We're talking about the Marxist theory of revolutionary change and the liberal theory of incremental change.
Let's dive into the Marxist perspective first then, rooted in the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The source emphasizes something right at the start that is absolutely central to understanding Marx's whole project.
Yes, it states pretty unequivocally that the analysis of social change is the central theme of Marxist thought. And to drive this home, it quotes Marx himself. Philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it.
That quote isn't just, a catchy phrase, it's the core motivation. And the source clarifies that this focus on changing the world is primarily about changing society. The physical world, according to this view as presented, is governed by immutable natural laws, laws of physics, chemistry, whatever, which science can understand and we can maybe utilize, but we can't fundamentally alter them. They are what they are.
So the physical realm is seen as one of necessity. Where does freedom fit into this picture then?
Freedom, in the Marxist sense explained by Engels in the source, is a stage achieved only after significant historical development. Specifically, it comes with the emergence of a classless and stateless society. It represents a state where humanity is no longer bound by the perceived inevitable laws of social development and can consciously create and recreate its social life according to its collective will.
Great. Engels describes this point as humanity's leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom, a really evocative phrase.
A move from being subject to historical forces to actively shaping them. And the framework for understanding this whole process of social change is provided by two interconnected principles: dialectical materialism and historical materialism.
Okay, let's take dialectical materialism first. This is presented as the philosophical basis of Marx's approach. The source explains how Marx borrowed the dialectical method from the philosopher Hegel, but fundamentally flipped its content. Hegel was an idealist. He believed that idea, or consciousness, was the fundamental reality, the essence driving change in the world.
But Marx flipped that on its head, arguing he stood Hegel right side up, as the saying goes.
Exactly. Marx was a materialist. For him, matter, the physical material world, was the fundamental essence and the driving force behind change. Social life, consequently, isn't just a reflection of abstract ideas, it's a reflection of concrete material conditions.
And he applied Hegel's dialectical method to this material reality. Hegel's dialectic involved this logical progression through conflict. You have a starting idea or situation, the thesis. It gets challenged by its opposing idea or situation, the antithesis. The interaction and conflict between them then lead to a new, higher stage that incorporates elements of both but resolves the contradiction that's the synthesis.
Right, and Hegel saw this process continuing the negation of negation, moving ever upwards towards an absolute idea or a perfect state, which he, rather controversially, identified with the nation-state, famously calling it the March of God on Earth.
So Marx took this dynamic structure, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, driven by internal struggle, but applied it not to the realm of ideas, but to the material world and the social relationships built upon it.
Precisely. He believed social institutions are fundamentally shaped by the material conditions determined by the mode of economic production. So, where Hegel saw conflict between ideas driving history forward, Marx saw conflict rooted in material forces and the social classes tied to those forces. This is his dialectical materialism. The source quotes George H. Sabine pointing out this continuity with Hegel. Marx kept the dialectic as a logic of development. He saw history as a process driven by struggle and identified power as the determining factor.
But Sabine also highlights the crucial Marxian shift. Power for Marx is primarily economic power, and the struggle is specifically class struggle, with political power being basically a consequence of one's economic position.
And Engels, the source notes, defined dialectics quite broadly as the science of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society, and thought. He even articulated 3 key laws of dialectics, which the source illustrates with material examples.
Okay, what are those 3 laws?
The first is the transformation of quantity into quality, and vice versa. The classic example given in the source is water. If you increase the temperature, that's a quantitative change. Eventually, you reach a point where it undergoes a qualitative change. It becomes steam. Decrease the temperature enough, another quantitative change, and it becomes ice, a different qualitative state. The same substance undergoes these qualitative shifts based on quantitative changes in its conditions.
So enough small, incremental quantitative changes eventually trigger a sudden qualitative leap, like reaching a tipping point.
Exactly that. The second law is the interpenetration of opposites. This means opposing forces or characteristics aren't entirely separate. They exist within or influence each other. The source uses the example of hard and soft. Iron is hard, but it can be molded, which shows a degree of softness. A flower is soft, but it maintains its shape, showing a degree of hardness. Opposites aren't absolute barriers. They interpenetrate and define each other.
Okay. And the third law, which is described as the basic principle of progress.
That's the negation of negation. This law suggests that every stage of development, the thesis, contains internal contradictions or seeds of its own decay. These contradictions eventually lead to the negation of that stage, its overthrow by an antithesis. But this antithesis is itself temporary. It too is negated by a synthesis that incorporates elements of both previous stages, but represents a higher level of development, relatively free from the old contradictions. This process continues, moving, in theory, towards a more perfect state.
And this source gives that material example. You sow a seed, thesis, it grows into a sprout, which negates or destroys the seed. The sprout, negation of the seed, then grows into a plant, negating the sprout. The plant, negation of the sprout, produces an ear of corn, which negates the plant as it withers. The ear of corn, negation of the plant, then reproduces the seed, often in greater quantity or better quality, which is seen as a sign of progress in this natural cycle.
It's a way of understanding development not as a smooth linear progression, but as a process driven by conflict, contradiction, and qualitative leaps, where each stage is superseded by a new one that both builds upon and overcomes the limitations of the previous one.
Okay, so dialectical materialism is the philosophical lens, the underlying logic. What about historical materialism?
Historical materialism is presented as the empirical basis. It's the application of dialectical materialism to the actual study of social history. Its core idea, the real heart of it, is that in any historical epoch, the way society organizes its economic life, the relations involved in producing, exchanging, and distributing material means of sustenance exerts a preponderating influence on all other aspects of society.
So not just an influence, but preponderating influence, the main driver.
Yes, the source really emphasizes that. It's seen as the primary, most significant determinant. According to historical materialism, all social, political, intellectual, ethical, even religious relationships in a society are fundamentally molded and shaped by its economic conditions and relations.
And this starts with the most basic human need, survival, which depends on being efficient in production.
Exactly. Production is seen as the most fundamental human activity, and society primarily exists because people working together in association can produce more effectively than individuals alone. A perfect society, from this perspective, would be one that efficiently secures all necessities for all its members.
And if needs aren't being met, what's the explanation then?
Unsatisfied needs, according to Marx, stem from defective modes of production. This frustration, this lack, leads people to imagine another world where their needs are met, and this gives rise to religion. The source includes Marx's very powerful description of religion as the sob of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the spirit of conditions utterly unspiritual.
But it's seen purely as a symptom, right? Not a cause of anything fundamental.
Precisely. It's viewed as a shadow cast by a flawed economic system. And therefore, in Marx's view, it will naturally pass away once the underlying economic defects are removed. This is where that famous phrase comes in. Religion is the opium of the people. It provides solace, it numbs the pain of oppression, but it doesn't address the root cause.
So the ultimate drivers of all historical development are changes in the process of material production. This is captured in that famous concept of the base and superstructure.
Yes, the source quotes Marx directly on this fundamental relationship. Quote, "In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will, relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure, the real basis on which rises a legal and political superstructure."
Okay, so the mode of production, the economic structure, how things are produced and who owns what, that's the real basis, the foundation, the base, and everything else, legal systems, political institutions, religion, philosophy, culture, morality, all of that is the superstructure, which is shaped by and rises upon this economic base.
And the superstructure, in this view, generally serves to maintain and legitimize the existing base. Now, what causes the base, the mode of production itself, to change over time?
The source explains it's an internal conflict within the mode of production itself. It quotes Marx again. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution.
Let's just quickly unpack the mode of production into its two key components, as the source does: the forces of production and the relations of production.
Right. The forces of production are the actual means by which society produces things. This includes the tools, the machines, the technology, factories, land, basically the means of production, and also the human element. The skills, knowledge, experience, and abilities needed to use those means, that's labor power.
And the relations of production. These are the social relationships people enter into as they produce. Crucially, this refers to the pattern of economic ownership of the means of production. In basically every society structured by class, those who own and control the means of production form the dominant class, while those who only have their labor power to sell form the dependent or exploited class.
Okay, so forces are the capabilities to produce. Relations are about who owns those capabilities and how people relate to each other in the process. Got it.
Now, the theory goes the inherent drive for human improvement, for efficiency, leads to the development of the forces of production. Technology gets better, science advances, knowledge increases, labor becomes more skilled through education and training.
And this development eventually outgrows the existing relations of production, the existing ownership structure.
Precisely. The source describes this development leading to a contradiction between the advancing forces and the stagnant relations. At a certain point, the existing relations of production, the current system of ownership, the class structure become incompatible with the further development and effective use of the now more advanced productive forces. They become fetters, they hold back progress, they stifle production.
And this contradiction, this clash, is what leads to the breakdown of the existing mode of production and its supporting superstructure. The source uses the example of the rise of industrialization, new forces of production like factories, steam power, machines clashing with the old feudal system relations of production based on lords owning land and serfs being tied to it. The feudal relations became a fetter on unleashing industrial potential, leading ultimately to the collapse of feudalism.
And this is exactly where the dialectical mechanism of thesis, antithesis, synthesis plays out in historical terms. The established order, the existing mode of production and its relations, that's the thesis, creates within itself the conditions for its own negation. New inventions or discoveries lead to developing productive forces that come into conflict with the old property relations. That's the antithesis.
And this clash between the old social relations and the new productive forces gives rise to a new revolutionary class whose interests align with the new forces, like the bourgeoisie rising with industrialization.
Exactly. This new class, empowered by its role in the emerging productive forces, is positioned to overthrow the existing order in what Marxists see as an often violent revolution. The old mode of production gives way to a new one. This is the progression seen through history. Slave societies were replaced by feudal, feudal by capitalist, and, in the Marxist prediction, capitalists will inevitably be replaced by socialists.
And each of these stages, because they contain these antagonistic classes and inherent contradictions, carries the seeds of its own decay, its own eventual overthrow.
Yes. Capital society, while viewed as a necessary step that destroyed feudalism, and thus in this specific sense was progressive relative to feudalism, is also seen as just another transitory phase. It too is doomed by its own fundamental contradiction. The conflict between the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the working class, the proletariat, who own only their labor power and are therefore exploited.
The source brings in Sabine again to elaborate on that transition from feudalism. He argues the abolition of feudalism saw the rise of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, who then created political systems like the democratic republic in its most developed form, specifically to consolidate and protect their economic power. The French Revolution, from this viewpoint, isn't primarily about abstract liberty, but is essentially a political revolution that transferred dominance from the old aristocracy and clergy to the new industrial and commercial middle class. The state created by this revolution is seen as a typical instrument for middle-class repression and exploitation of the workers.
And the philosophy that emerged alongside it, things like natural rights in politics and economics, is viewed basically as the ideal justification, the ideological cover for the middle class's right to exploit the worker.
So, just as the bourgeoisie displaced the feudal lords, capitalism's inherent class conflict is expected to lead to another revolution. The rising proletariat displacing the middle class.
And Sabine's point about the proletariat, as highlighted in the source, is crucial here. Their philosophy is socialism, a claim to human rights for those without property. But unlike previous rising classes, the proletariat is at the very bottom of the heap. There's no class below them for them to exploit in turn. Therefore, a proletarian revolution doesn't just transfer power to a new dominant class to start a new cycle of exploitation. It aims to abolish exploitation altogether.
And this is why it's seen as the first step towards a society without class distinctions at all, a true beginning of human history where humanity can achieve full self-realization, finally entering that kingdom of freedom.
This leads directly back to the theory of revolution itself, which isn't just an optional extra in this framework, but an absolutely integral component of this whole dialectical materialist view of history.
The source reiterates that while the development of the thesis and its antithesis might be a slow, gradual process, the arrival of the synthesis, the revolutionary breakthrough, appears in a sudden stroke resulting from the accumulated conflict and contradiction. No historical stage is overthrown until its relations have become a complete fetter on the fully developed productive forces. And the change itself, when it comes, is always sudden and total, like that water instantaneously turning to steam when it hits the boiling point.
Any significant, epoch-making social change, according to this theory, is always the product of revolution. Revolution isn't just possible, it's necessary. It's the indispensable midwife of social change.
But why is revolution specifically necessary? Why can't change happen gradually through reform?
The source explains that at each stage of history, the dominant class develops and promotes an ideology, a whole set of ideas, beliefs, values, laws, cultural norms that serve to sustain the existing social relations and lend legitimacy to its rule. The dominant class has powerful vested interest in maintaining the current system, even if that system has become outmoded and is actually acting as a fetter on the development of productive forces. They benefit from the status quo.
So even when the underlying material conditions, the economic base, are crying out for change, the superstructure, the ideology, the political institutions, the power of the dominant class stands firmly in the way.
Exactly. The new productive forces and the revolutionary class associated with them must overcome this resistance. They can't just tweak the system. They have to smash the existing economic substructure and the entire superstructure built upon it. The institutions, the legal system, the dominant culture, the prevailing ideology in order to clear the ground and lay the foundations for a new order based on new relations of production. The dominant class, possessing state power and deep vested interests, simply will not relinquish control until it is forcibly overthrown by the new revolutionary class.
So revolution is seen as inextricably linked to class struggle. You can't have one without the other in this framework.
It's presented as an essential concomitant of class struggle, absolutely necessary to achieve an effective transfer of power and usher in a new historical epoch. Social revolution, the text states, is the necessary lever of social change.
And class struggle itself is defined as that constant, ongoing conflict between the dominant class, the owners of the means of production, and the dependent class, those who must sell their labor. A struggle that began, really, with the emergence of private property, and whose interests are seen as fundamentally irreconcilable.
This struggle, according to the theory, entered its most decisive phase under capitalism with the bourgeoisie and proletariat. And importantly, it's believed to continue even after the socialist revolution, during the transition period, until the remnants of private property and class division are fully liquidated and a truly classless society is achieved.
Right. And ideology, as we touched on, is defined specifically as that set of ideas used by the dominant class to legitimize its rule, making exploitation or the existing power structure seem natural, inevitable, or even just.
Exactly. So the path of history, from the Marxist perspective laid out here, is essentially a series of revolutions. The capitalist system itself was established by the revolutionary overthrow of feudalism, symbolized perhaps most clearly by the French Revolution. Now, capitalism, having developed its productive forces but also its internal contradictions, has itself become a fetter and must, therefore, be overthrown by the proletariat in a new revolution.
The source includes that famous, very forceful call to action from Marx and Engels' The Communist Manifesto. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution.
Yeah, that's not just detached analysis. It's a clear call for conscious revolutionary action. It urges the development of class consciousness and strong political organization among the proletariat to actively accelerate this process, which they see as historically inevitable anyway.
And the proletarian revolution is presented as being fundamentally different from all the revolutions that came before it. How so?
That's a really key distinction they make. Previous revolutions, like the bourgeois revolution that overthrew feudalism, were seen as being accomplished by a relatively small class, the bourgeoisie, acting primarily in its own narrow interest. Their goal was simply to establish its own supremacy and dominance, effectively setting up a new system of exploitation, just with a different dominant class, the bourgeoisie exploiting the proletariat instead of lords exploiting serfs.
But the proletarian revolution, according to this theory, is different because
it's presented as a revolution of the vast majority against the small minority of exploiters. It's the masses rising up. And crucially, its goal is not to win power in order to establish a new system of exploitation, but to put an end to the entire system of exploitation itself by abolishing the private ownership of the means of production, which is seen as the ultimate root cause of all class division and exploitation.
And because it aims to abolish exploitation and class divisions entirely, it's seen as the final revolution in history.
That's the idea, yes. It establishes socialism in place of capitalism, primarily by abolishing private property, meaning private ownership of the means of production, through the socialization of those means, factories, land, etc.
But this transition isn't presented as instantaneous or easy.
No, definitely not. The source notes that it requires a necessary, though temporary, stage, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This isn't seen as the final goal, but as an essential prelude to communism. It's a mechanism, a form of state power used by the victorious working class to suppress potential counter-revolution from the deposed capitalist class and to actively liquidate the remaining elements of the capitalist system, its economic structures, its ideology, its culture, its institutions.
And the source is careful to define what's meant by this dictatorship. It's not just tyranny.
It clarifies that under the dictatorship of the proletariat, classes still technically exist, as the old ones are being dismantled, and the state, as an inherently oppressive mechanism, still exists. However, crucially, it's presented as a state of the propertyless majority used specifically for the purpose of liquidating the private property system and capitalist ideology. This is contrasted with all previous states, which were seen as states of a property-holding minority used for the oppression of the majority.
So the task of this proletarian state, then, is...
Its main tasks are twofold. First, to undertake the fullest possible development of the new productive forces, pushing technological advancement and gearing production towards meeting social needs rather than generating private profit. And second, in doing so, to pave the way for the gradual evolution of a truly classless society and eventually the withering away of the state itself.
Ah, okay. So while the transition to socialism requires revolution, the transition from socialism to full communism is presented as more of an evolutionary process.
Right. Exactly. Communism is seen as blossoming organically from the soil of established socialism once the conditions are fully ripe. No new revolution is considered necessary for that final step. The source references Lenin's work, State and Revolution, where he distinguished these two stages. Socialist society is still seen as imperfect, retaining some elements of bourgeois rights, specifically the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his work. This means people are still rewarded based somewhat on how much they contribute, not purely based on their needs.
But communism is the ideal, the final stage of history in this view.
Yes, representing the highest possible development of productive forces where scarcity has been overcome. It's governed by the truly communistic principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Production is so abundant and socially organized that everyone's needs can be met, and work becomes a voluntary contribution to the collective good, not something done out of necessity or for unequal reward.
And the state.
The source quotes Lenin again to underscore the link between this final stage in freedom and the fate of the state. While the state exists, there can be no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state. The state, fundamentally seen as an instrument of class oppression, simply becomes redundant and unnecessary in a fully realized classless society and therefore withers away.
Okay. Finally, the source briefly touches on a later development, or maybe modification, in Marxist thought, the doctrine of permanent revolution, associated particularly with Mao Zedong.
Right. This view sort of modified the idea of the final revolution, arguing that class struggle doesn't simply end with the establishment of a socialist state. Contradictions, it argues, inevitably persist within the new society, contradictions between progressive and conservative elements, between advanced and backward ways of doing things, between positive and negative forces, maybe even between the forces and conditions of production in new forms.
So the struggle has to continue even under socialism.
Yes. According to this doctrine, these internal contradictions must be fought perpetually through ongoing struggle and transformation to prevent stagnation or backsliding and to continually push towards the full realization of communism. The doctrine of permanent revolution posits that revolution isn't just a single event that establishes socialism, but a perpetual, continuing process of struggle and transformation within the socialist state itself.
Wow. Okay, that gives us a really comprehensive overview of the Marxist framework for social change as it's presented in the source driven by material conditions, class struggle, these dialectical processes, and culminating in necessary, often violent, revolutionary transformation toward a predicted, classless, stateless society.
Now let's shift gears completely and look at the starkly contrasting liberal theory of incremental change, championed in the source primarily through the work of the philosopher Karl Popper.
Right. The liberal view, as presented here, fundamentally rejects the deterministic elements we just saw in theories like Marx's. It denies that human history proceeds according to some grand, predetermined plan that's beyond human control. Instead, the source highlights the liberal belief in humans as rational beings, capable of applying their intelligence, their effort, and their will to actively mold and rebuild their social institutions.
And arising directly from this belief in human agency and rationality is a very clear preference regarding the process of social reconstruction. Liberals generally prefer reform to revolution. The source presents Karl Popper as providing some particularly powerful arguments for this preference.
And his primary line of attack is directed against what he calls historicism.
Yes, exactly. In his major work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper really vigorously critiques historicism. He defines it as the belief in these overarching large-scale laws of historical development, the kind of deterministic views he attributes to thinkers like Hegel, Marx, and even Oswald Spengler laws that claim to reveal an inevitable trajectory of history that's essentially beyond human control or intervention. The implication being that human ingenuity and deliberate action can't fundamentally alter the course of history. We're just along for the ride.
And Popper sees historicism as not just intellectually flawed, but actually dangerous.
Very much so. The source states that Popper argues historicism is often used as a mask for an uncritical attachment to a totalitarian ideology. By claiming inevitability, historicist thinking can be used, and has been used, he argues, to justify tyranny, oppression, and violence, all in the name of supposedly assisting the inevitable march of history towards its predetermined goal. He dismisses historicism pretty strongly as pseudoscience.
How does he distinguish it from genuine science? What's the difference for him?
Popper argues that genuine science proceeds by formulating hypotheses, specific testable claims, which are then subjected to rigorous testing and, crucially, attempted falsification through observation and experiment. A scientific hypothesis must, in principle, be capable of being proven wrong by evidence. That's what makes it scientific.
And pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience, in contrast, promotes beliefs that are either not open to falsification at all, you can't even imagine an observation that would disprove them, or they're actively protected from falsification by constantly adding qualifications or reinterpreting any inconvenient evidence to make it fit the theory. Popper sees historicism as fitting this pattern perfectly, claiming to explain the entirety of history under a single deterministic principle that leaves no real room for genuine novelty or departure from its predicted path. It's unfalsifiable.
And the source notes who his main targets, his false prophets of historicism, are in the Open Society and its enemies.
Yes, his big three are Plato, Hegel, and Marx. Plato, he argues, provided the philosophical roots and justification for totalitarian control, censorship, and the use of noble lies or myths to maintain a rigid social order. Hegel for creating what Popper saw as the dangerous myth of nationalism and state worship, famously dubbing the state the March of God on Earth. And Marx for creating the myth of inevitable class war and necessary violent revolution.
And what is his overarching critique of these figures and the historicist approach they represent?
Popper argues that these historicist thinkers ultimately promoted what he calls a closed society, one that suppresses free speech, denies equal rights, and stifles critical deliberation because it believes it already possesses the final inevitable truth about history and society. He contends very strongly that genuine science and human freedom can only flourish in an open society, one characterized by the free exchange of ideas, robust critical discussion, tolerance of dissent, and a fundamental willingness to question established beliefs and accept new evidence, even if it's uncomfortable.
He provides some further, more technical arguments against historicism in another key work, The Poverty of Historicism.
Yes, he refutes it there on two main grounds. First, he argues that the growth of human knowledge itself has a profound and undeniable influence on the course of human history. But fundamentally, neither the future growth of knowledge nor its specific effects on society can possibly be predicted. If we could predict tomorrow's scientific discovery or breakthrough idea today, it would mean we already possess that knowledge now, which is a logical contradiction.
That's a really powerful point, actually. You can't predict future knowledge.
Exactly. You can't know what you don't know yet. And second, he argues that social science, unlike perhaps some idealized view of physics, cannot generate universal, deterministic laws of total social development. At best, social science can develop laws or understandings applicable to fragmented and isolated social units or specific types of social phenomena, but not for the entirety of historical change as a single predictable process.
So those grand, sweeping, predictable historical laws of the kind claimed by historicism are, for Popper, simply impossible. They're a philosophical illusion.
He concludes that what historicists call historical laws are, at best, merely indications of a historical tendency. Marx's law of the concentration of capital, for example, might describe a tendency observed under certain conditions in capitalist history, but it's not an ironclad deterministic law that guarantees a specific future outcome, regardless of human action or other factors. Forecasting based solely on such tendencies, Popper argues, is inherently misleading and unlikely to yield correct, reliable predictions about the future.
This rejection of historicism and the idea of predictable total change leads Popper to emphasize something called methodological individualism. What's that about?
He contrasts his approach with what he calls methodological holism, which he associates with thinkers like Hegel and Marx. Holism tends to treat society as a collective entity, arguing that social behavior and historical development can only be understood by looking at the whole, not just the individual parts. It often leads to treating society as if it were a single organism or unit with its own emergent laws, which fits neatly with historicist attempts to find grand laws for society as a whole.
And methodological individualism is the opposite.
Yes. Popper, as a strong champion of individualism, asserts that any valid explanation in social science or history must ultimately be couched entirely in terms of facts about individual human beings, their properties, their goals, their beliefs, their actions, and crucially, the often unintended consequences of those actions interacting. Society, for Popper, is the complex result of these individual interactions, not some separate entity floating above them with its own predetermined destiny.
So, since history is seen as singular, unique, and influenced by the unpredictable actions and evolving knowledge of individuals, and its long-term future cannot be scientifically predicted, attempts to reshape society totally based on grand, predetermined blueprints are fundamentally misguided and potentially dangerous.
Precisely. This is why he is so critical of central planning on a grand scale and what he calls holistic social engineering. These ambitious attempts to design and implement a blueprint for society as a whole, according to some preconceived ideal or alleged understanding of historical destiny.
And this brings him directly to his preferred concept for how social change should happen: incremental change.
Right. Given the futility of attempting total, predictable change, and perhaps even more importantly, the inherent imperfections of our knowledge about the incredibly complex consequences of any social action, Popper argues that focusing on who is fit to rule or trying to design perfect utopian systems is actually asking the wrong question.
So what's the right question, according to Popper?
A more practical and relevant question is something like, how can we design our institutions in such a way that they minimize the risk of bad rulers doing too much damage? Or, more broadly, how can we minimize the harm caused by our inevitable mistakes and unintended consequences, acknowledging that we simply cannot predict all outcomes or perfect human society itself?
So how do we proceed with changing society if we can't plan it all out perfectly or know the future with certainty?
Popper's core warning, as presented in the source, is that any rational action aimed at social change must always take into account the fundamental imperfections of our knowledge. Therefore, the safest, most rational, and indeed most scientific course of action is to advance in small steps. This policy is what he terms piecemeal social engineering, or, more simply, incremental change.
It sounds like a very cautious, almost pragmatic approach.
It absolutely is. The core idea is to make small, specific changes designed to address particular identifiable problems or evils in society. And critically, the approach emphasizes the need to carefully monitor the result and ensure that any unexpected negative effects or unintended consequences of these actions are identified and corrected as soon as they arise before they can snowball and do widespread or irreversible damage. It's about constant feedback, adjustment, and correction based on real-world experience.
And this is contrasted very sharply with what he calls utopian social engineering.
Right. Utopian social engineering, in Popper's critique, is the attempt to radically transform society completely, all at once, based on some blueprint for a remote, complex, supposedly perfect ideal like the Marxist vision of a completely classless society, perhaps. While the utopian ideal itself might sound appealing or fascinating, the source suggests Popper argues such grand schemes are often incapable of being put into practice effectively, or, more likely, their cost in terms of social disruption, suffering, and loss of freedom vastly outweighs any potential, often hypothetical, benefits.
And what are the main problems he sees with trying to actually implement these grand utopian schemes?
The source points out two key issues Popper raises. First, there's very little possibility of achieving genuine, widespread agreement across society on such a remote and complex utopian ideal, or on the radical, often coercive means required to achieve it. People will have different visions of perfection or disagree fundamentally about the methods. Second, precisely because of this lack of consensus and the radical nature of the changes proposed, utopian schemes can usually only be implemented by authoritarian means, often involving widespread violence and the suppression of dissent against those who disagree or resist the grand plan.
In contrast, piecemeal reform, the incremental approach, is focused on removing a specific, presently existing evil or solving a concrete problem.
Exactly. Because it targets a clear current problem, like poverty in a specific area, inequality in access to education, or a particular dysfunctional institution, there's likely to be much broader agreement across society on the need for that specific reform. This makes it far more likely, Popper argues, that the change can be implemented smoothly and peacefully through democratic processes and consensus without needing authoritarian force.
The source also highlights a kind of moral argument Popper makes against these large-scale utopian projects.
Yes, he points out that utopian projects, by their very nature, often demand enormous sacrifices from a current generation for the sake of achieving a distant, perhaps never fully realized ideal future. The generation making the sacrifices may not live to see or enjoy the supposed benefits, and the future generation that supposedly benefits might not even appreciate or value the sacrifices made by their predecessors. Piecemeal engineering, Popper suggests, avoids this kind of intergenerational injustice because the benefits, removing a specific current evil, and the costs are experienced more immediately and directly by the same people involved in the change.
And finally, Popper uses an analogy from the progress of science itself to bolster his argument for gradualism in social change.
He argues that the very nature and historical growth of scientific knowledge vindicate a gradualist, piecemeal approach. Science doesn't typically arrive at definitive, absolute truth in a single revolutionary stroke. Instead, it progresses through a process of step-by-step approximation to truth by proposing theories, testing them, and then successively amending or rejecting them based on new evidence and critical discussion. He suggests that social reform is most effective and rational if it proceeds in the same gradual, adaptive, self-correcting manner, mirroring the cumulative progress of science.
So, for Popper, gradual social reform is the rational, scientific, and moral path forward, a stark contrast to the revolutionary path advocated by Marxists. He's less averse to purely intellectual revolutions, of course, as the source notes, since they don't usually involve spilling blood.
The source concludes this section with a brief critical appraisal, acknowledging that Popper's concept provides a strong philosophical justification for the traditional liberal preference for reform over revolution. He's essentially drawing moral and political conclusions from his particular view of the scientific method applied to the complexities of society.
However, the source does note that this preference for gradual reforms remains debatable. It's not universally accepted.
No, it mentions the critique offered by thinkers like Georges Sorel, for instance, who argued quite vehemently that gradual reforms ultimately achieve very little in the long term. Small concessions granted by a privileged class might temporarily mitigate discontent among the oppressed or exploited, but they don't fundamentally alter the underlying power structure or address the root causes of exploitation or inequality. So, Sorel and others argued they fail to provide durable, lasting solutions. They're seen essentially as bandages on a deep wound, not a cure.
So the counterargument is that reforms might just prolong the underlying problems, making people feel slightly better without actually changing the fundamental dynamics.
Right, that's the essence of that critique. However, the source immediately acknowledges that champions of reform counter this by pointing to the often immense human cost, the undeniable violence, and the widespread bloodshed that revolutions frequently entail. There's a clear moral trade-off presented here between the potential for radical, long-term effectiveness, which critics of reform claim for revolution, and the immediate, often horrific human cost, which advocates of reform highlight as the danger of revolution.
Ultimately, the source concludes this section by suggesting that there really is no single, foolproof method of social reconstruction that guarantees perfect outcomes without significant risks or downsides.
And it offers a word of caution for advocates of both approaches, based on historical experience. Those who advocate for revolution should be extremely cautious to ensure that the process of liquidating one privileged class doesn't inadvertently lead to the emergence of a new privileged class, perhaps in a different guise, like a bureaucratic elite, simply perpetuating inequality and oppression in a new form.
A very real danger. And the caution for advocates of reform.
Those who advocate for reform should be careful to ensure that their incremental efforts don't just have a fleeting, superficial effect that quickly evaporates. They need to ensure reforms genuinely contribute to meaningful, progressive goals, like promoting real equality of opportunity and tangibly reducing significant disparities in power, prestige, and wealth, addressing the very issues that often fuel the calls for more radical, revolutionary change in the first place. If reform doesn't deliver tangible progress on deep-seated issues, it might lose its legitimacy.
Right, so those are the two major contrasting frameworks presented in the Source for Understanding Societal Transformation. The Marxist view emphasizing revolutionary shifts driven by fundamental material contradictions and class struggle, seeing history moving through necessary, often violent ruptures towards a predicted end state.
And the liberal view, exemplified here by Popper, which rejects historical determinism, champions individual rationality but also acknowledges our limited knowledge, and advocates for cautious, step-by-step, incremental reforms as the only rational, scientific, and peaceful way to address social problems and improve the human condition.
So what does this all mean for us, taking this all in? We've taken a really deep dive into these specific excerpts from O.P. Gauba's An Introduction to Political Theory. We started by establishing the core vocabulary of social change, revolution, evolution, development, and progress, making sure we understood their distinct meanings as presented in the text.
Uh-huh. Then we looked at the broad sweep of history through the eyes of various classic thinkers like Comte, Spencer, Maine, Tönnies, Durkheim, and Weber, seeing how they characterized the major transitions from older to newer societal forms, using their different conceptual lenses, things like status to contract, Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, mechanical to organic solidarity.
And then we spent a significant chunk of our time really unpacking the two major and fundamentally opposing contemporary theories highlighted in the text. First, the Marxist theory, grounded in dialectical and historical materialism, viewing history as driven primarily by contradictions in the mode of production and the resulting class struggle, inevitably leading, in their view, to revolutionary overthrow and the eventual establishment of a classless society.
And second, the liberal theory, articulated here through Karl Popper's powerful critique of historicism and his advocacy for methodological individualism and piecemeal social engineering. This view champions gradual, incremental reforms as the rational and moral path, precisely because it acknowledges our limited knowledge and the inherent dangers of attempting grand, utopian, revolutionary transformations.
These aren't just, dry academic ideas locked away in books. They represent powerful competing frameworks that offer dramatically different ways of viewing the forces shaping the societies we live in right now. They propose very different drivers, very different mechanisms, and very different potential outcomes for how societal transformation happens, or how it should happen.
Absolutely. We've worked to extract these key perspectives directly from the source material provided, aiming to give you a focused understanding of these contrasting views on the engine of history and the complex dynamics of social change, strictly as presented in Gauba's text.
It's definitely a lot to consider, and these theories offer such different lenses through which to interpret the world around us.
They really do. Very different implications depending on which lens you look through.
Absolutely. So maybe to leave you with a final thought, drawing directly from the material we've explored today, considering these fundamentally different perspectives on how societies change, whether it's through sudden fundamental upheaval rooted in deep material conflict and class struggle, or through careful, cautious, step-by-step reform that acknowledges our limited knowledge and capacity to predict the future. How do you see the forces of change playing out in the world around us today? Which of these frameworks, if either, feels like a more powerful or more relevant lens for understanding the transformations, the tensions, the shifts happening right now?
Yeah, something to definitely mull over as you look at the news tonight or think about the big challenges we face.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the process of social change, as illuminated by these specific readings.